Hey, it's Doug with Backcountry Pilgrim, and today I am going to hike the HITE'S Cove, South Merced, and Savage-Lundy trails, a section that most people would probably never have heard of were it not for the mysterious deaths of an entire family in nearly the same place along this route. Now, the details of their death caused quite a bit of speculation about how it happened, ranging from knowledgeable speculators to ignorant fantasizers. I'll be going over those as I go along this hike, but before I give my thoughts on what happened, I thought it would be good if I actually hiked the trail so that I would know what I was talking about. I'm going to be hiking with my buddy Deb, so come along as we explore the mystery of this tragic situation and still have a look at the beauty that the family saw before they passed. On Sunday, August 15th, 2021, a young family was found dead on a remote trail near Mariposa, California. Jonathan Garish, 45, was a software engineer, and his wife, Ellen Chung, 30, was a yoga instructor and graduate student in counseling. They were parents to their 1-year-old daughter, Aurelia Miju Garish. Included in this family was Oski, their 8-year-old Akita mixed dog. The Garish-Chung family had moved from the Bay Area to Mariposa County the year before to escape the city and raise their daughter closer to nature. And their deaths that Sunday caused one of the most famous investigations in recent California history. Confusion and controversy were inflated by early reporting which contained several misconceptions and falsehoods. Another factor that added to the mystery were several reports that Garish and Chung were experienced hikers, which it was argued would have ruled out several otherwise plausible explanations for how the family seemed to have died at nearly the same time and in the same place. Now, after consulting several reports, I believe their deaths were due to basically one mistake that was at the root of all the other factors, which would not have been an issue otherwise. Now, I do not wish to exploit this tragedy for social media hits. What I do want to do is help others avoid the mistake that ended this family's life. I also want to point out that I am not casting judgment. Although I do believe mistakes were made, I have made more than one of them myself. And second, there are potential reasons that even a seasoned hiker could repeat the same mistake if they were in the same circumstances. Importantly, the main cause of their deaths had nothing to do with algae or aliens, toxic gases, lightning strikes, murder, or suicide. Although nearly all of these potential causes were investigated, continuing to push such theories does not help anyone, as they make reoccurrence seem unlikely and preparation unnecessary. So in this video, I want to do something that most of the talking heads who judged the incident from the comfort of their studios did not do. I am going to make my assessments while hiking the trail itself. The trail system that the family chose to hike was in the Sierra National Forest, a portion of which the father, Jonathan Garish, apparently had explored before in May of 2017. Importantly, this was before the major Ferguson fire of 2018 completely changed the landscape into something he would not have recognized the year before. Now, I traced this route out on Onyx, which said that it was a 7.5-mile route with 2,400 feet of elevation gain. However, at the end of our hike, Strava clocked it at 8.25 miles with over 2,500 feet of gains. Now, initial reports incorrectly said that the couple was found in Devil's Gulch, California. Devil's Gulch, California is a location near Point Reyes along the coast. They likely confused this location with another Devil's Gulch, which is actually the name of a terrain feature somewhat nearby where the family's bodies were found. Later reports updated the location to HITE'S Cove, which is also false. HITE'S Cove is about 2 miles downriver from this route. Now here the confusion is somewhat more understandable, as there are several things named HITE'S Cove nearby this area. HITE'S Cove is the road that takes you to the trailhead, and HITE'S Cove Trail was part of the 3-part trail system that they put together to create this hiking loop. Somewhat incredibly, the HITE'S Cove Trail was then mistakenly thought to be a route to HITE'S Cove that begins miles away on Highway 140. This is actually a hike that I have done. You can check it out if you want to at the end of the video, and I've put the link in the video description. Where the family really was along the Savage-Lundy Trail. This is the final of 3 connected trails that begin at the HITE'S Cove trailhead, which joins the Savage-Lundy Trail via the South Merced River Trail in the canyon below. Most reports pointed out that Garish had this route on his phone via a hiking app, and those that identified it said that it was the popular All Trails hiking app. However, as of January 2026 at least, this exact route is not on All Trails. You can see it on the map, but it is not clickable as a known route that would display any information. I even saw one news report say that the app did not include elevation gain, but if this was All Trails, then that is false. All Trails has always included elevation gain. In fact, I don't know of any hiking apps that do not. Phone records, including texts and photos, confirm several points about the hike. They began from the trailhead just before 8 a.m. Photos reveal that they made it to the river canyon below and started taking some family selfies, apparently unconcerned at that point about their safety. By 12:25, they were calling and texting unsuccessfully for help and died where they were, around halfway up the Savage-Lundy section of the loop. Reports say that by this time, the temperatures there likely rose to well above 100 degrees, some sources saying 109. The next day, a missing persons report was filed, and on August 17th, 2 days later, the search and rescue team located the bodies of the family and their dog about 1.8 miles and 1,270 feet up the Savage-Lundy Trail. They were 1.6 miles and 780 feet of elevation gain from their vehicle. Having completed 5.8 miles and 1,500 feet of elevation gain, they were found in nearly the same spot. Jonathan, Miju, and the dog were found together with Ellen's body somewhat farther up the hill, off trail, apparently trying to cut the switchbacks and make a direct beeline to their vehicle. Investigators documented the following gear found with or near the bodies: a 2.5 liter or 85 ounce Osprey Hydraulics LT bladder, which was practically empty, a baby carrier backpack rig, a snake bite kit, a first aid kit, and bug spray, a knife, diapers, 2 sippy cups, one with formula remains still in it, and a teething wafer wrapper. They had some light snacks and 1 cell phone. No GPS tracking was being actively logged during the hike. Finally, they found Oski's leash. The dog was off leash when found. Now, the unusual circumstances, 4 deaths of an apparently healthy family, led to a wide and pretty intense investigation. The Mariposa County Sheriff's Office explored multiple possibilities, including homicide, suicide, toxic gases from mines, toxic algae from the river, a lightning strike, hyperthermia, and dehydration. Armchair critics and conspiracy theorists came up with even more possibilities, which varied from the ridiculous to borderline ludicrous. The problem is that whichever theory was proposed, some alleged fact seemed to discredit or at least seriously weaken it. However, air and soil samples were tested, mine shafts were examined, water from the river was analyzed, and the case continued to draw significant public attention. Toxic algae bloom was detected downstream in the Merced River, but was ruled not to have played a role because these cyanotoxins were not found to have been ingested, nor an exposure pathway found for the family. There was also no signs of injury or foul play, rock slide, or toxic gases. There was no damage to clothing or gear or overturned rocks or environmental hazards indicating a fall. So finally, after an extensive 2-month investigation, on October 21st, 2021, the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office announced the official findings. The cause of the death for all 3 family members was hyperthermia, overheating, with probable dehydration complications and heat-related illness for the dog. Now, in case you don't know, hyperthermia is a general term for when the body's core temperature rises above normal. Heat stroke is a severe, life-threatening form of hyperthermia, which occurs when the body's temperature rises above 104 degrees Fahrenheit and the body can no longer cool itself. Now, the summer of 2021 was exceptionally hot across much of the western United States, and California included among states with record summer heat. Temperatures on the exposed portion of the trail were estimated to have reached nearly 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The USDA later estimated that ground level temperatures could have reached even higher, between 110 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit, with radiant heat from all the bare rock, which could increase the heat of the hike even more than the ambient air temperature. With heavy sun exposure, steep terrain, minimal shade due to the Ferguson fire, and insufficient hydration, the family is believed to have succumbed rapidly to these extreme conditions. Assuming that the baby would have started succumbing to hyperthermia first, it is not difficult to imagine that both parents would have been moving with a purpose, going as fast as they could to try to reach their vehicle, which would have increased the rate of their falling to hyperthermia. With no satellite communicator and no cell phone signal, the family had no way of signaling for rescue. Now, many people called this diagnosis into question, stating the fact that experienced hikers would not have made the kinds of mistakes that led to death from hyperthermia, but cell phone data showed Jonathan trying to text out a plea for rescue. It read, "Can you help us? On Savage-Lundy Trail, heading back to HITE'S Cove Trail, no water in other words, overheating with baby." Thus, all of the data seems to point to hyperthermia with dehydration complications, and it is possible to construct a narrative that makes sense out of the family's final locations and account for the fact that they were allegedly experienced hikers. Now, I hiked this trail with my friend Deb on January 15th in the middle of winter, not August 15th, so our temperatures were in the 60s. We hiked from 9:30 a.m. to 3:45 p.m. with about 4 hours of moving time. We began on the HITE'S Cove Trail, which is actually a super steep fire road, covered in shale and rock, which makes it difficult to maintain footing, even simply going downhill. I've never described a downhill as brutal, but my legs were shaking by the time we got to the bottom at 10:42.1 miles and 1,935 feet later. We nearly missed the South Merced Trail because it was grown over with grass, a state that remained through much of it. I was surprised to see that the trail stays fairly high above the river until the very end, where it branches into the Savage-Lundy Trail at Skeleton Creek below Devil's Gulch. Much of the trail is narrow, single track with big drops, unclear fade-outs, and much more elevation gain and loss than I was expecting. Add to this some washed-out trail and downed trees, and it turned out that the South Merced River Trail was actually the most challenging of the 3 sections. Now, it took us until about 1 p.m. to traverse the 1.9 miles with 450 feet of gains in 2 hours and 20 minutes. Not far from where the South Merced River Trail splits off to the Savage-Lundy Trail, you reach the one and only time that the trail brings you very close to the Merced River. At the bottom of the Savage-Lundy Trail is pretty much the only good water source for this entire loop. This is not the last place to get water, because the Savage-Lundy Trail follows Skeleton Creek through Devil's Gulch, and where the trails merge, it is a pretty easy walk to get down to Skeleton Creek. So there were actually 2 different water sources that could have been used to refill the family's water bottle. Now, the toxic algae bloom that they did discover was downriver from this area, and I never read any reports about whether Skeleton Creek was tested. However, the Savage-Lundy Trail climbs so quickly that Skeleton Creek is soon left behind. Now, contrary to one critic who sarcastically said that they should have had a clue about the heat with a name like Devil's Gulch, it is in fact quite a pleasant area. There are still plenty of trees giving shade, and Skeleton Creek is absolutely beautiful. As I said earlier, Devil's Gulch is also not where they died. The Savage-Lundy Trail is a combination of short zigzag switchbacks and a few other switchbacks that have pretty long traverses in between. The half a dozen zigzags will take you up 430 feet, and I can tell you from experience that at that point the water seems very far away. 1.2 miles up the trail, after a series of long traverse switchbacks, you finally reach the little draw where all the bodies except Ellen's were found here. Now, at this time, the draw is filled with almost impassable bush cover, but it probably would have been fairly barren in 2021. I will tell you that it is simply too steep to climb. It would be a completely desperate move to try to cut these switchbacks because the switchbacks themselves are fairly steep. There's a reason that these long traverses were put in. Doing a few calculations with the map, I discovered that this hill seems to be about as steep as parts of the Half Dome cable route. However, the Half Dome cable route has a cable to help you climb, and it is made of granite, which you typically have pretty good traction on. The hill that the Savage-Lundy Trail goes up, however, is a mixture of broken rock and loose dirt. It would have been nearly impossible to climb up this safely, and completely impossible to do so with any decent amount of speed. Every single step would have been a massive energy-depleting move, and although it makes sense to try to cut the distance down by skipping the switchbacks, it would have been an absolutely brutal route to try to take. The standard route back to their vehicle would have been 1.6 miles and another 780 feet. Given that they had already spent over 2 hours in 100+ degree sunshine with no shade, and probably rapidly running out of water, either because they drank it or simply poured it on themselves or the baby, which would have been a wise move, by the way, at that point at least, it is really not surprising that they didn't make it. The diagnosis of hyperthermia with dehydration complications makes perfect sense. What seems to throw some people off of this explanation is that Garish and Chung were both considered to be experienced hikers, and it just doesn't seem like they would have made the kind of mistakes they did that would have led to this eventuality. It also seemed very strange that they were all found dead in the same place. However, I do not think it is very difficult to construct a narrative that makes sense out of all of this. I believe that the one mistake that allowed the other factors to combine into their eventual death was simply not being prepared for the heat. It does not appear that the family knew what to expect given the weather report. However, this would have been made worse by the fact that the weather was about 70 degrees when they got started. They then would have probably fairly rapidly descended into the shady traverse of the Merced River, which would have shielded them from much of the heat increase during that long traverse along the river. By the time they got to the point where they were able to get down into the water and probably cooled off and maybe even refilled their hydration bladder, the full force of the heat that was being generated was still in their future. And by the time they broke out of the shade and tree cover of the bottom of the Savage-Lundy Trail near Devil's Gulch, they were already so high up that a return to that water probably didn't seem like a very good idea. Probably by the time they were really concerned, it was likely because the baby was beginning to succumb to the heat. At this time, they were well above the water and the shade, and probably began to drink or maybe pour whatever was left of their water in order to keep the baby and themselves going. This is actually the preferred treatment for heat stroke, and if they thought they were approaching that, or that the baby was already in that zone, it would not have been the wrong thing to do. They probably started pushing very hard to get up the rest of the trail and reach their car, which was now closer than the water would have been. Of course, they have to go uphill, up these pretty strenuous switchbacks, and that would have caused their bodies to succumb to hyperthermia faster. Of course, being relatively healthy, being experienced hikers, it's not a big surprise that they thought that was the way to go. I know personally that if I was on a hike toward my vehicle and my child started dying, my instinct would be to just move harder and faster and get them to safety as soon as I possibly could. What Jonathan and Ellen did not know was that, number one, the hardest part of their hike was still in front of them. It was going to continue to get even hotter than it already was, and it wouldn't have worked anyway, because the key fob to their vehicle was actually found about 100 feet below where they died, so they must have lost the key on the way up. If they had gotten to the car, they wouldn't have been able to get in it, and they wouldn't have been able to start it and drive unless they had a spare hidden somewhere on the vehicle. If they had had to hike out, it would have been an additional 1.3 miles and 180 feet of elevation gain to reach the nearest homes. It was around noon that the family seems to have realized that they were in very serious trouble and were likely not going to make it out on their own. At 11:56 a.m., they sent a text for help, and by 12:30 they had made a series of attempted calls, none of which made it out as there was no cell signal in that area. And so they stopped in the shadiest spot they could, and Ellen probably either stayed with them until it was clear that she was the only one that was going to make it out, or they stopped and she took off immediately. Either way, she died very soon in her struggle to climb. She was only found about 15 or 20 feet away. The pretty obvious danger of the heat and that narrative of why the family stuck together pretty much explains everything we know about the case, and there is no need to posit additional factors such as toxins or other dangers of nature. Again, initial reports were riddled with inaccuracies, and some people reacted just based on those. However, I have seen many claims that simply don't hold up once you know the facts and know enough about the outdoors to make a more accurate call. One claim was that healthy adults don't die that quickly. The idea being that no matter how bad things got, finishing an 8-mile hike should have been able to be done by any healthy adult. But the truth is, heat stroke can incapacitate someone in minutes in extreme exposure, and way faster for infants and large dogs, which are covered in hair. They are especially vulnerable, and it is probably what was happening to the baby that led them to push so hard for the summit that probably added to their vulnerability to hyperthermia. Another claim was that they wouldn't all die at once, but the truth is, no one says they did. What we know is that they died in roughly the same place, which is completely understandable for a struggling family with a loyal dog. You don't just bail on your family at the first sign of danger, and they probably tried to stick together both for safety and just out of love and loyalty to one another. Another claim was they were only 1.6 miles from safety, so something else must have happened. The truth is this is very difficult terrain. As I mentioned earlier, the Savage-Lundy Trail ascends a hill that is roughly the same angle as Half Dome. It's a 55% grade or a 30-degree slope. And again, as I said, this is not climber-friendly materials that the hill is made of, but rather crumbly rock and dense bush. And even if, in 2021, the dense bush was not yet an issue, the crumbling rock and that extreme slope would have been very, very difficult to climb, especially when someone is already on the verge of succumbing to hyperthermia. Others simply claim, oh, they should have gone back down and got water. It was right there. But the truth is, it was way too far by the time they were in trouble. They were closer to the car than they were to the water, which I can tell you looks very, very far away. And I think a natural instinct would have been to try to get to the car rather than to turn around and hike back down the trail you're trying to get out of. I once found myself in 100-degree weather having to make a decision about whether I would descend to a river and re-up my water before turning around and heading back to the trailhead. I decided that the amount of energy and time that it would take to descend the hill that I was on to get all the way down to the river and fill up on liquid and then climb all the way back would basically cancel itself out. In other words, it was better for me to slow down and conserve my energy and my heat production to make it out of this 100-degree hike without drinking a bunch of water, rather than to increase my energy output and heat and make it even later and hotter in the day just to get right back to where I already was and have to start the hike that I could have done immediately. Now, of course, I didn't have a dying baby with me, and so I was able to do what I needed to do to slow down, pace myself, and get out of the situation. And we need to remember that what killed them was hyperthermia and not dehydration. It actually takes a pretty long time to die from dehydration, which basically thickens up the blood and causes other problems. It also would have increased the effects of the hyperthermia. So while it certainly was not helping that they didn't have any more water to drink, the amount of risk they would have taken and the energy they would have expended and the later in the day it would have become by trying to go down and get water just wouldn't have been worth it. By the time they got back to where they were, they probably would simply be out of water again, only now they would have hours of more hiking wearing them down. It would be even later and hotter in the day. And of course, if the baby was already succumbing, it really wouldn't have done any good at all. Let me put an asterisk there, because when I talk later about whether or not they could have survived this hike, I will come back to this point. Others claim that if the problem was just water, the dog at least would have left the family, as survival instinct would overrule loyalty instinct. But the truth is, you cannot see the water from where they passed away. And of course, their family pet may have been more loyal than it was a survivor. Probably the biggest mistaken thinking in all of this is the idea that experienced hikers would have fill in the blank. Experienced hikers would have known the dangers. Experienced hikers would have checked the weather. Experienced hikers would have brought this or brought that, or not brought this or not brought that. A lot is being read into the situation about what experienced hikers would have done. There are several problems with this line of thinking that I imagine is probably leading to the most confusion. First of all, it does not follow that experienced hikers would have known several of the things they would have had to avoid the situation. Hiking doesn't give you knowledge of everything, and if you're not used to hiking in certain areas, the knowledge that you do have might even be the opposite of what you need to know. Keep in mind, Jonathan and Ellen were from the Bay Area, and they were new to Mariposa. They'd only been there a year. If everything they learned about hiking was hiking around the Bay Area, they might have thought that a liter per adult was plenty of liquid for an 8-mile hike. Further, often repetition is confused with actual experience. Simply doing the same thing over and over and over again doesn't really give you more experience. You just have that experience more times. So if this hike was very different from the kinds of hikes that they usually went on, that experience doesn't really count for much. On the other hand, experience can also cause false confidence. Maybe they had hiked quite a bit in Mariposa and thought that they really had the place locked down and approached it with a confidence that they shouldn't have. Further, there are some signs that they were not as experienced as people seem to think they were. For example, let's look at their gear list. They had no satellite communication device and only one cell phone. Even more telling is the fact that there was no water filter or purification system in their gear. And this makes their hydration choice even more of a mystery. 2.5 liters for 2 adults, a baby, and a dog would not be considered sufficient on practically any decent hike. However, if the family was planning to refill at the river, a 2.5 liter hydration bladder might have been considered plenty. However, if they knew that cyanotoxins had been found in the Merced River because they had checked the news and seen the warnings from a couple of weeks back, and they were expert enough in water filtration to know that there is basically no way that any kind of portable gear can make water safe from that kind of toxic algae, then it would make sense that they didn't bring a water filter. But then it wouldn't make sense that they only brought 2.5 liters of clean water with them. A newbie mistake and an expert decision can be the same for different reasons. But again, let's keep in mind, dehydration is not what killed the family. Could they have survived the hyperthermia and made it longer if they were better hydrated? That is almost certainly the case. Would it have been enough to get them the rest of that difficult hike? That is very difficult to say. In addition to having no satellite or water filter, the family also carried no headlamp or flashlight. And that means that at least 6 out of the 10 hiking essentials were not carried by this family when they went out. Other essentials include the ability to make fire, shelter, and have sufficient or extra food. Now, while they didn't end up needing many of these, one of the essentials definitely should have been there, and that is sun protection. Not only did they find no sunscreen, but they didn't even find any hats. Jonathan Garish was in shorts and a t-shirt, Ellen had a tank top and shorts, and they were going to go out for an 8-mile hike with thousands of feet of elevation gain and loss on a south-facing hill that was going to be blasted by sun. Now, I realize that neither hats nor sunscreen would have saved them from hyperthermia, but the fact that these things weren't even brought makes it more difficult for me to believe that they were really experienced hikers. Unless they had been out in the sun quite a bit and had so much experience with it that they knew that they were going to be able to hike in those clothes without sun protection. Again, this is where it's difficult to know whether you're dealing with someone who just blew it or someone who had enough experience to make a questionable decision based on that experience. Now, in their first aid, they also had a snakebite kit, which is kind of a relic of a bygone era. Most experienced hikers now know that snakebite kits do not contain anything useful, but I do think it is safe to say that these gear choices seem to point to people that were definitely not ready for the kind of hike that they were about to face. I think we can say yes, mistakes were made, but most of those mistakes would not have mattered were it not for how hot it was. So the question becomes, how did they not foresee the temperatures? Did they not check the weather? Or were they relying on feel and simply just didn't realize how bad things were getting until it was too late? So I do want to discuss one more question, and that is, could they have survived? Well, looking back with 2020 vision, I would say that their best chance would have been that once they realized the amount of trouble they were in, that they turn around and hike back down to Devil's Gulch, or all the way to the river if the creek was dry. There, they might have been able to wait out the day with water to drink, water to cool down, and shade to protect them from the worst of the heat, and then they would have had to hike out after or near dark. Of course, this would have been more difficult because they didn't have any light, but the Savage-Lundy Trail is not one that would be easy to get lost on. This guess at a best chance for survival is based on the rule of 3. It's more of a guideline than a rule, really, but essentially what it says is that if you are looking to survive outside, you've got about 3 minutes that you can live without air, 3 hours without shelter if you're in harsh conditions, which they were, 3 days without water, not including babies who can barely make it one day, and 3 weeks without food. They probably were in the heat stroke area where drinking wouldn't have even been a good idea, and the only way to reverse the danger would be to use an external cooling source like sitting in a creek or a river. Now, a follow-up question. Would I have done that? Probably not. I think that given their situation, with the baby probably fading out in front of their eyes, the lure of the vehicle being so close compared to how far away that creek and the river were, combined with the panic of seeing my baby dying, our lack of supplies, including food, plus the confusion that comes with heat-related issues, I really don't know if I could have talked myself into turning around and going so far back down the trail. So in summary, the family died of hyperthermia because they made one major mistake, which was not being prepared for the heat. Other mistakes or simply unwise decisions were made, but all of them could have been overcome had they not been caught in the open by this intense weather. I've averaged 1 hike a week for the last several years. I have made nearly all of these mistakes or unwise decisions myself at one time or another, and it is probably by the grace of God alone that I did not suffer worse for those mistakes and unwise decisions than I did. So this is it. This is where Jonathan, the baby and the dog stopped, and Ellen tried to climb up through that to make a beeline for the truck. I imagine this brush wasn't here 4.5 years ago because of the Ferguson fire. This was probably totally exposed, and you can see it is absolutely steep. Not at all surprising that she did not make it very far up there. We have been very lucky today to be in quite a bit of shade. If it was 100 and something degrees out here and exposed, it just would have been absolutely brutal. Given the time of day, it was only getting hotter, so hyperthermia makes perfect sense. I don't personally see a huge mystery here. All of the facts can be explained by hyperthermia, complicated by dehydration. This trail even surprised us. Even after doing all the research and everything, it was quite a bit more difficult than we expected. We did not have nearly the kind of problems the family would have. So rest in peace, Garish Chung family. God bless you. Gonna finish out this hike, see how we feel. hope that this has been an informative video to you. If it has, why don't you give it a like and subscribe to Backcountry Pilgrim if you are into hiking, camping, backpacking, and the gear that goes with it. Until next time, I'm Doug. Thank you for watching.